My name is Jonathan L. Walton. I am the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and Pusey Minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard University. I am trained as a social ethicist. I engage religion in varying forms of society. And today I had the pleasure of being here at the Center of Law and Religion to discuss the theme of religious freedom in general, but the way that it's played out in competing conceptions of the right and the good in the Black freedom struggle. Well, I mean, one of the major debates of the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century within the Black freedom struggle, was within the National Baptist Convention, where its president, the Reverend Joseph H. Jackson, was a towering, persuasive voice, and he had very different understandings of the role of religious freedom, the role of civil disobedience, and protest. And so therefore, he often found himself at odds with the person who we often think of, and that's Martin Luther King Jr. And so in the letter from a Birmingham jail that was published in 1963, quite often we understand it as a response to the Good Friday letter that came from 8 white clergymen and rabbi from the local Birmingham, where they were kind of saying that his protests were untimely, that civil disobedience was unwise, and the like. And so King responds to them. But really, King was also responding to the critiques that were coming out of his own previous denomination, the National Baptist Convention, under the leadership of J.H. Jackson. Reverend J.H. Jackson was a patriot. He was a patriot. He loved this nation, and he believed in the founding documents and the kind of constitutional protections, and that all forms of protest should adhere to the internal systems that are already built in. Right? So beyond voting, right, there is amendment, there's ratification, there are varying strategies, but civil disobedience for Jackson lays beyond the pale, because it could end up devolving, or it always devolves into lawlessness and disorder. And he was a man of law and order. And really one of the reasons that Jackson kind of conceptualized of American society in this light was because of what he saw as the core principles of his faith. And that was freedom and freedom of conscience. Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God and loving your neighbor as yourself, right? Unique to that is this kind of love of neighbor, love of self, and this freedom of individual consciousness. And he thought that America's project of democracy and its founding documents was the best representation that we have in civic life of that. And so therefore, there was consistency for Jackson between the First Amendment, freedom of religion and religious protections, and the freedom that is found in the life of Christ. I mean, Martin Luther King and J.H. Jackson had similar backgrounds. Both kind of were products of the Afro-evangelical tradition, Afro-Protestant evangelical tradition. One might argue that as a leader in the movement, as one who lived and operated his ministry in the city of Chicago, right, outside of the kind of really terrorizing structures of the South and the rigid lines of Jim Crow, that James H. Jackson just had a different perspective than King. And so his faith in the democratic project, his religious conservatism, was much more representative of the Baptist tradition. So if anything, King was probably more of a departure from the faith of his father, if you will. And why? Because even though King was, for the most part, a child of privilege, King decided that he intentionally wanted to align with those who were on the underside of not just racial oppression, but also economic exploitation and oppression. And I think that is what gave King and Jackson, in part, their diverging paths. Reinhold Niebuhr says in Moral Man, Immoral Society that special privileges make liars out of all men. And I think that these were two men who were both raised with special privileges. But I think we see a Martin Luther King Jr. who took a much more noble and magnanimous approach to the suffering of others. When we're talking about freedom of religion, I think we have to constantly ask ourselves, freedom for what? There were certain freedoms and protections that I think for most of the 18th, 19th, and large part 20th century, that a privileged Protestant group was able to take for granted. Why do I say that? Because if we're talking about these kind of concepts of religious freedom as an ideal, as many have argued much better than I ever could, it was just kind of a secular variant of progressive Protestantism, right? Emphasis on the individual, right? And freedom of consciousness, freedom of self-determination, for instance. And these were all kind of lifted up and hoisted high as privileged Protestant themes and privileged themes of a liberal secular democracy. As our society has changed, as we've grown in beautiful diversity and pluralism, there are certain assumptions and conceptions of the social contract that we can no longer take for granted. And so when we're talking about freedom of conscience, in the case of King and Jackson, it was freedom from racial oppression. It was freedom from economic discrimination and exploitation. It was this sort of negative freedom. Now what we see, and I'm scared, the language of freedom of self-conscience and individual conscience is often being deployed to further concretize majority perspectives and allowing individuals to opt out of the social contracts that actually protect the most vulnerable among us. And when I think about the lens of love, I'm thinking about seeing how God sees. Not that we have the mind and not that we have the conception of God, not at all. But when we look at the Bible, the kind of overarching arc from Genesis to Revelation, there's a prevailing theme, and that is that God sides with those on the underside of power, on the underside of privilege. And so it's like when Hagar left the house and was largely driven away by Abraham and Sarah. And then God shows up. And she calls God El Roy, the God who sees. God saw her in her misery and her desperation. And so who do we look for when we're reading biblical accounts? The more in our interpretive process that we can try to see like God sees and look for the most vulnerable and the victimized in biblical accounts, the more that I believe we can start to develop the sort of empathy and ethical approach to actually begin to live that out in the world that we inhabit. Well, one of the things that I'm trying to do with the lens of love is to offer these sorts of reading strategies that we read the Bible in a particular way, that we actually even embrace a certain narrative ethics, right? That we're actually able to live out the stories that we inhabit in the Bible so that we're able to live them out with the people who we walk beside each and every day. Right? And so if we are able to develop more compassion and we're able to think self-critically about our own privileges and our own blessings, and how we might use the resources that God has given us to be a blessing to others, then I think we're seeing the world through a lens of love. And so even when we think about the conversation here this week about freedom of religion, the religious freedom clause, part of my fear, as I said before, is that if it's simply an appeal to personal conscience that does not have to be defended, that does not have to be debated through democratic deliberation, then it's easy for us to just devolve into a sort of majority rule in a tyrannical way over an oppressed minority. And so therefore I can say, well, because of my Christian commitments, right, I don't have to serve these type of people. Because of my Christian commitments, I don't have to allow these people of this religious perspective to be a foster family. Right? And so then all of a sudden, our religious conscience and our religious faith has become a weapon against the most vulnerable. And I just believe, call me crazy, that God has called us to use our privilege and our power to tools to help serve the most vulnerable. Communities of accountability are so important. I think that's the strength of communities of faith, as well as intellectual communities. I love I love teaching seminars. I love being part of seminars, as I've been a part of this week. Why? Because we all put our ideas on the table, and then we're able to hold one another accountable to our ideals, to our professions, and sometimes we change. Sometimes we take our relative truths and we're able to move to greater truths. That's the academic enterprise. It's not that different within communities of faith. I think that we come together. We engage in process of learning and growing and loving together, where we're able to hold one another to account, right, for our commitments. I feel all the time, for instance, I'm the Plummer professor of Christian morals. I'm the Pusey Minister. I'm always trying to lead with my values. So on campus, what groups on campus, now at least, right, seem to be the most vulnerable, the most victimized? Those are the groups that we privilege. I'm always trying to lead like that. Right? Why? So that if anyone ever sees me operating outside of that framework, they feel comfortable calling me to account and holding me to the standard that I've professed for myself. That's the beauty of communities of faith, when we're able to speak truth to one another in love, right? Because we make each other better. Iron sharpens iron. It's funny, when I wrote Watch This in 2009, and I was trying to talk about or discuss the ways that these forms of religious broadcasting and these sorts of evangelical preachers that we've tended to think about as being marginal characters. I was trying to say, no, they're actually mainstream characters. And part of the reason they're mainstream characters is because they actually profess a particular ethic that really resonates with a cross-section of American society. And that ethic is from rags to riches, right? That God helps those who help themselves, and that we can measure success and we can measure worth and human value, right, by the accumulation of things. And so it's this neoliberal framework, right, that we know the way that it impacted corporate American culture. I was saying that we're seeing the same things in the churches. The prosperity gospel is just a spiritual variant of these kind of larger political and economic realities. Right? And examples that I gave as kind of high priests of American culture in 2009, two examples that I provided were Jack Welch and Donald Trump. Lo and behold, right? I had no idea that I was being prophetic at the time. But, and what have we seen? That now he is largely televangelist in chief. Because not only does he understand the themes that resonate with a cross-section of society, he also understands that an image is worth 1,000 words. And like televangelist, he's talking loud even when he's not saying anything at all. And so in that regard, I actually feel pretty good about how Watch This has lasted over the last decade. It is so vital to our future as a nation. These questions of religious freedom, these questions of what we owe one another, how we're going to live together in an increasingly pluralistic society. For some people, these make great test cases. For some people, it's an academic exercise. How can I one-up an argument, right? That's not the case for me. For me, this is a matter of life and death. When we understand that we live in a world where LGBTQ identifying or questioning teens are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than their peers. when we understand the impact of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, right, and the unbridled violence and terror that we see from Pittsburgh to New Zealand to Wisconsin. This is not an academic exercise. And so we have to think seriously and we have to think soberly about how we are going to join together to create not just a sense of the common good, but even move further than that toward what Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. called a beloved community, more enriched with a sense of goodness and social obligation. Because King put it best, we can either live together as brothers or sisters, or we're going to die together as fools.